Welcome to Life Stories. One whisper from a silent child shattered everything a billionaire mother thought she knew about love, disability, and the power of being seen. Imagine spending millions on experts, therapies, and diagnoses, only to discover that the key to your son's voice was hiding in the basement, wearing a janitor's uniform. This isn't a story about miracles. It's a story about listening, about the invisible people we pass by every day, who just might be holding the answers we never thought to ask for. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll question not only who you trust, but what it truly means to understand someone you love. Now, let's go back to the day it all began, with a boy, a book, and a woman the world chose to ignore. The marble floors of the Whitmore estate didn't echo with laughter. They rang hollow with footsteps, clipped and calculated like the woman who owned them. Charlotte Whitmore stood at the top of the staircase, arms crossed, a glass of untouched Chardonnay in one hand and fury smoldering in her chest. Below her, in the living room flooded with winter sunlight, a woman in a Navy janitor's uniform knelt beside a small boy. 7-year-old Noah Whitmore sat cross-legged, his pale fingers brushing across the pages of a large picture book in Italian. The woman, Grace Bailey, was speaking softly, her voice barely louder than the rustling pages. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, her voice sharp and slicing, the kind that made assistants flinch and waiters freeze. "Why are you speaking to my son?" Grace rose slowly. She didn't look startled or guilty, just tired and calm. "He came over to me," she said evenly. "I was reorganizing the books," and he started pointing at the pages. Charlotte's stiletto heels clicked on the floor as she approached. "My son doesn't speak. He hasn't spoken in 2 years. 3 specialists confirmed he's severely autistic. He doesn't interact. He doesn't learn. So tell me, what exactly were you trying to do here? Inspire him with your mop?" Grace didn't answer immediately. She watched the boy. Noah, wide-eyed and silent, traced a word with his finger. "Gatto." Then he looked up at Grace, and with an almost imperceptible breath, he whispered, "Merci, madame." Charlotte dropped the glass. It shattered against the floor, shards skipping across the stone. Grace didn't flinch. She knelt again, slowly, meeting Noah's gaze as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He speaks," she said gently, "not because he's broken, because no one's ever spoken to him in a language he understands." Later, in her private office, Charlotte exploded. "You overstepped. I want you cleaning the basement only. No interaction with Noah. At all." Grace nodded, not arguing. She didn't need to. She had seen it in Noah's eyes, the recognition, the hunger for connection, the brilliance that had been mislabeled as absence. What Charlotte couldn't see, or wouldn't, Grace had been trained to find. Years ago, before her mother's illness and the mountain of medical bills, Grace had held a PhD from NYU in applied linguistics, specializing in neurodivergent children. She had taught at 2 universities and published articles in Child Cognition Quarterly, but she hadn't told anyone at the Whitmore estate who she really was. There was no space for dignity and desperation, only silence and survival. That night, while scrubbing grout in the basement, she heard careful footsteps descending the stairs. Dr. Alan Rivera, the family's private pediatrician, appeared in the dim light. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, voice low. "Noah spoke to you, in French." Grace stood slowly, unsure whether to retreat or defend herself. "Yes, he did. Not echolalia, not a random sound. He responded. It was intentional. It was connection." She met his gaze. Something passed between them, mutual recognition. "I've seen it before," she said. "Selective mutism combined with high auditory sensitivity. Noah isn't silent. He's been waiting for someone to speak his language." Rivera blinked. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" "I was an academic," she said carefully. "My thesis was on multilingual intervention for nonverbal children. But that part of my life," she trailed off. "Life happens." He stepped closer. "Can you help him?" "I can try, but it has to be quiet. If his mother finds out, I'll handle that," Rivera interrupted, slipping a card into her hand. "Send me updates. I'll cover whatever you need medically. Just help him." In the weeks that followed, Grace left small breadcrumbs for Noah, Flashcards in Spanish tucked under his pillow, a picture book with Mandarin characters slipped beneath his bed, animal posters labeled in Italian and Arabic. She whispered words as she cleaned. Noah listened, and slowly he responded. She never pushed. She waited. And then one night, she dialed a number she hadn't touched in 2 years. James Williams, the voice answered, familiar and warm. "It's Grace," she whispered. "Grace Bailey, I need my files." There was silence, then a rush of words. "God, Grace, where have you been? NYU's been trying to reach you. Your research has been cited all year. Harvard's asking for you." "I'm not ready to come back," she said, "but I need the intervention protocols for a child." "I'll send them tonight." But Grace hadn't realized someone had been listening. Sandra, the head housekeeper, had overheard just enough, PhD, research, child cognition, to stir trouble. The next morning, Grace was summoned to Charlotte's office. The air was thick, still. A laptop sat open on the desk, displaying her academic profile from NYU. Dr. Grace Bailey, Applied Linguistics, Child Language Development. "You lied," Charlotte said flatly. "I didn't," Grace replied. "You just never asked. You let me believe you were no one." Grace's voice never wavered. "You treated me that way whether I had a PhD or not." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "You think you're better than us now?" "No," Grace said. "But I know better than to underestimate a child's voice just because it's quiet." And then, just as the tension reached its edge, the door burst open. Noah. He ran in, breathless and glowing, his cheeks flushed with joy. "Grace," he shouted in Portuguese, then turned to Charlotte. "Mama, I counted to 20 in Japanese." Charlotte froze. Dr. Rivera stepped in behind him, tablet in hand. "He's been progressing. We've documented everything. He now speaks 6 languages, fluently, understands them too." Charlotte's hands trembled. "But he was mute. They said he would never." "They were wrong," Grace said quietly, "because they never listened." What would you do if the person you dismissed turned out to be the one saving your child's future? Can love and understanding truly rewrite a child's destiny where medicine and money have failed? As Charlotte stares into her son's eyes, clear, bright, and filled with words, she realizes that everything she thought she knew is about to unravel, and it all started with a whisper. The silence in the room was no longer heavy, it was electric. Charlotte stood motionless, trying to reconcile the boy in front of her with the diagnosis she had clung to like a shield. Noah, her Noah, grinning from ear to ear, just rattled off numbers in Japanese as if it were a game. Grace stood nearby, hands folded, watching everything unfold with a quiet intensity. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't smug. She was something else, contained, as if holding back a wave that had been building for years. Dr. Rivera placed the tablet on Charlotte's desk. "This is a record of Noah's progress over the past 3 weeks. Grace has been working with him in short, controlled sessions under my supervision, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, ASL, French, and now Japanese. And it's not rote memorization. He understands, he engages, he jokes." His voice softened. "Charlotte, your son isn't severely autistic. He has sensory sensitivities, yes, social anxiety, absolutely. But his silence was never from inability, it was from fear." Charlotte turned toward Grace, her voice brittle. "Why didn't you tell me all this before, from the beginning?" Grace inhaled slowly. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me. You didn't see me. I was a uniform, a set of hands. I was invisible in your world, even when your son wasn't." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You called my voice an intrusion, my presence a threat, and maybe I didn't have the strength to fight back then. I just wanted to help him." Charlotte's composure fractured. She looked away, but the shame clung to her skin like cold sweat. "I thought I was doing what was best for him." "You were protecting him," Grace said gently, "but you weren't listening to him." That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot in the servants' wing, staring at the wall, heart pounding. For the first time since arriving at the Whitmore estate, she felt something dangerously close to hope. But it was tangled in fear, because everything had shifted too fast, too soon. She didn't expect the knock at her door. Charlotte stood there, holding a glass of water and a legal-looking envelope. Her makeup had been wiped off. She looked smaller, human. "I need to ask you something," she said, stepping inside, "and I need you to be honest." Grace nodded, wary. Why did you really take this job? Why here? Out of all the places you could have gone, why my house? My son?" For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then she pulled open the drawer of her nightstand and took out a folded article, yellowed, creased, worn from years of being read and reread. She handed it over. Charlotte read the headline aloud: "Pharma Heirs Breakthrough Drug Saves Hundreds of Children with Neurological Disorders." "I wrote my thesis using children who received early intervention after your company's trial," Grace explained. "I followed those kids for years. I knew your name. When my mother's condition worsened and I lost my position, I remembered this mansion. I thought, maybe here I could find a way back, or at least make some good happen from somewhere that started it all." Charlotte stared at the article, her hands trembling. "So you came here to what? Finish your work?" "I came here," Grace said softly, "because I had nowhere else to go. But when I saw Noah, I stayed because I saw a boy who was locked behind the same glass wall I've seen so many children trapped behind. And I knew I could help him, if someone just let me try." Charlotte didn't speak. She reached for the envelope. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. Standard. I was going to have you sign it tonight. Keep things clean. Protect my image." Grace looked at the envelope and then back at Charlotte. "Do you still want me to sign it?" Charlotte shook her head. "No. I want you to tear it up." She turned to go, but paused at the door. "Dr. Rivera thinks we should make this official. Hire you as Noah's full-time intervention specialist. Not just here. He wants to start a pilot study with other families. But there's one condition." Grace raised her eyebrows. "You tell the world who you are." For a second, Grace didn't know what to say. She had spent so long hiding, behind grief, behind shame, behind cleaning supplies, and silence. To step forward now felt like peeling away armor she wasn't sure she could live without. But then she thought of Noah, his small voice echoing in Japanese, his bright eyes full of questions and pride. She nodded. "Then let's begin. Do you believe redemption can come from the very person we once underestimated or even mistreated? And if so, would you have the courage to admit it, as Charlotte just did?" But just as trust begins to bloom, a threat from Grace's past reemerges, one that could destroy everything she's rebuilt. In the next part of the story, loyalty will be tested, reputations will hang by a thread, and a buried betrayal will finally come to light. Grace stood at the front of the lecture hall, the lights above her casting long shadows across the rows of seated educators, therapists, and parents. Beside her, 8-year-old Noah adjusted the microphone clipped to his collar, his small fingers trembling, but his eyes were clear. He looked up at her, seeking her calm. She gave him a gentle nod. It was time. "My name is Noah Whitmore," he said, voice quiet but steady. "A year ago, I didn't talk. People said I couldn't, that I wouldn't, but I was never silent. I was just speaking a different language. Dr. Bailey, Miss Grace, she heard me. She taught me how to speak in a way the world could understand." Gasps swept through the audience as he seamlessly moved into Spanish, then French, followed by a sweet phrase in American Sign Language. The room held its breath. It wasn't just what he said, it was how, with pride, with certainty, with light in his voice. Grace blinked back tears. This was never about proving people wrong. It was about letting one child be right in his own way. 6 months had passed since Charlotte tore up the NDA and publicly announced Grace as Noah's full-time developmental linguist. The media had been brutal at first. Accusations, headlines, edited sound bites suggesting the Whitmores had hired a fraud. But Charlotte stood firm beside Grace in every press conference, stating with fierce conviction that her son had been saved not by wealth, but by a woman society had chosen not to see. The nonprofit they created together, the Listening Project, had already reached over 100 families. Grace had given interviews, accepted awards, and been invited to return to NYU as a full professor. But she hadn't accepted. Not yet. Not when Noah was still growing, still healing. She had promised him she'd stay until he could fly on his own. And he was flying. After the standing ovation died down, Grace stepped to the microphone. "What happened to Noah isn't a miracle," she began. "It's not a once-in-a-lifetime story. It's what happens when we stop forcing children to speak our language and instead learn to hear theirs." There was something fierce in her softness, something unshakable in her voice. And yet, behind it all, she was tired, not weary from work, but from something deeper, an ache that had taken root and wouldn't let go, because Grace had been hiding something. The calls from her mother's hospice nurse had grown more urgent. The cancer had returned, aggressive and unrelenting. Grace had visited every weekend, sitting at her mother's side, telling her about Noah, about the foundation, about the kids they were helping. Her mother no longer responded, but Grace still spoke, as she always had, believing in the power of language even when there were no replies. 1 week after the conference, Grace received the final call. She drove through the night and arrived just before dawn. Her mother's eyes fluttered open for a moment as Grace knelt by the bed. With a voice that sounded like wind through broken glass, she whispered, "You did it, Gracie. You used the gift." Grace held her hand until it went still. The funeral was quiet. Charlotte attended. So did Dr. Rivera. Noah sent a card in 5 languages that read, "I love you the way you taught me to." Returning to the estate felt surreal. The halls were no longer cold. Laughter floated through the rooms. Noah was now tutoring a younger girl in Spanish. Her parents had joined the Foundation's program. Grace watched from the hallway, letting herself feel the weight of what had been built, what had been saved. That night, Charlotte found her in the garden. "You're leaving," she said softly. Grace nodded. "NYU offered me a full-time position, tenure. I'll be leading their new multilingual intervention research unit. It's time." Charlotte smiled, but her eyes shimmered. "I always thought you were here to save Noah, but you saved me too. You taught me to listen, not just to him, to everything I never wanted to hear." Grace hesitated. "Will he be okay?" "He already is," Charlotte said, "because of you." As Grace packed her few belongings the next day, she found the old Italian book Noah had first spoken from. Inside it, tucked between the pages, was a folded sheet of paper in crayon. "Dear Miss Grace, I used to think I was broken. Now I know I was just waiting. Thank you for hearing me first. Love, Noah." She pressed the note to her chest. As her car pulled away from the estate, Noah ran down the driveway, waving wildly. Grace rolled down the window. "Don't forget your verbs," she called out. "I won't," he shouted. "And I'll teach someone else too." 2 years later, Grace Bailey, now Dr. Grace Bailey again, stood at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, invited to speak about the future of inclusive education. She opened her speech the same way she always did, not with credentials, not with statistics, but with a story about a boy, a book, and a whisper that changed everything. How did this story make you feel? Did it leave you thinking differently about how we listen and to whom? Comment 100 if you love this story. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know your country. And if this touched your heart, please share it with a friend who believes in second chances. Thank you for watching Life Stories.